If you've ever gotten into an argument with your significant other so bad that you wanted to stab, skin, decapitate, and then feed them to their children, well, you aren't alone. Today, we'll be looking into the disturbing life of Katherine Knight. Katherine Knight was born on October 24th, 1955. She was actually born a twin, and her family would have many troubles early on. Katherine's father, Ken, was an abusive alcoholic and would essay her mother up to 10 times a day, and Katherine herself would claim that she was essayed by many of her family members, not including her father, until she was about 11 years old, a claim that her family would confirm. Well, in Katherine's younger years, she would tell her mother about a boy who wanted to do a sexual act that she didn't feel comfortable with, and her mom would simply respond with, "Put up with it and stop complaining." This paints a good picture of the type of relationship they had. Katherine was actually an extremely smart and talented student growing up, but she would struggle with violent rage and anger whenever she was upset. She would go on to assault a boy with a weapon at school and even attack a teacher. She would then drop out of school at just 15 years old, and without knowing how to read or write, she would pick up her first job working as a cutter in a clothing factory. But in less than a year, she would get what she described as her dream job, a position as a butcher. She was quickly promoted at the local butcher shop and would even get her own set of butcher knives. She would hang these knives above her bed at night just so she could, quote, have them whenever she needed them. She would continue this tradition at every single place she lived. In 1973, Katherine would meet her first husband, David Kellet. They would have a wedding service in 1974 where Katherine would drive in a motorcycle and David, heavily intoxicated, would be in the passenger seat. At the wedding, Katherine's own mother would give David some extremely disturbing advice. In his own words, "The old girl said to me, watch out. You better watch this one or she'll effing kill you. Stir her up the wrong way or do the wrong thing and you're effed. Don't ever think of playing up on her, she'll effing kill you. She told me she's got something loose. She's got a screw loose somewhere." Well, if that wasn't a perfect excuse to just run away from the wedding, I'm not sure what would be. And on that same very night, their wedding night, Katherine would attempt to strangle David. Her reasoning was that he just fell asleep after only having 3 rounds of sexual intercourse. Well, this would be a clear indication of how the marriage would continue. The next few months would continue to be extremely violent, with one occasion being when Katherine was pregnant. She would burn all of David's shoes and clothing and smack him across the face with a frying pan. All of this because David had returned home late because he was in a darts championship and had made it to the finals. David would barely escape this situation and would end up collapsing at a neighbor's house. He would be treated for head fractures. Now you might think that David would put her in jail and move on with his life as soon as possible, but you'd be wrong. Somehow, Katherine would convince him to drop all charges. David, though, would go on to leave after the birth of their first child in May of 1976. Katherine would be seen mistreating her newborn in public and would be admitted to a hospital for postnatal depression. However, the hospital didn't help one bit because as soon as she was released, she would tie the baby to a railroad track, then head into town and threaten to kill several people with an axe she had stolen. By some miracle, a man happened to be foraging around the area where the baby had been tied to the tracks, and he was able to save her just minutes before the train came through. Katherine would be arrested and admitted to the very same hospital, but she would sign herself out the very next day. How and why she was able to do this, I have absolutely no clue. Well, only a few days later, she would slash the face of another woman with one of her butcher knives and would demand that she drive her to Queensland to try and find David. The woman would escape at a service station along the way, but Katherine would take a young boy hostage with her knife. When police arrived, she was disarmed and admitted to yet another psychiatric hospital. At this hospital, she admitted to nurses that she planned on killing the mechanic at the service station for the only reason being that he had helped repair David's car at one point. She also admitted that she planned to drive into Queensland and kill David and his mother. When police let David know of her plan, him, his girlfriend, and mother would all pick up and leave for Aberdeen. Katherine was released yet again on August 9th, 1976 to the care of her mother-in-law, and somehow she convinced David to get back with her and they moved to Woodride, Brisbane. She would then get a job at another butcher shop, and on March 6, 1980, they would have their second daughter, Natasha Marie. However, only 4 years later, Katherine would leave David and move in with her parents. She'd ended up hurting her back and would receive disability pension and be given a house in Aberdeen. Well, eventually in 1986, Katherine would begin dating again. She would meet a man named David Sanders, a minor who was 38 years old. After only a few months, he would move in with Katherine and her 2 daughters. However, at some point, Katherine would kick him out and then, of course, beg him to come back. A year later, in 1987, she would cut the throat of his 2-month-old puppy right in front of him just to scare him from ever wanting to have an affair. She would then do the Katherine special and knock him unconscious with a frying pan. Well, somehow, David still didn't want to leave because in 1988, Katherine would have her 3rd daughter, Sarah. Katherine would then decorate the house with animal skins, horns, skulls, rusty animal traps, leather jackets, machetes, rakes, and pitchforks. There was practically no space left open in the house. David would move back into his old apartment again after an argument would occur where Katherine would hit him in the face with an iron and stab him in the stomach with scissors. When he returned to the house, Katherine had cut up all his clothes, and this startled David so much that he quit his job and went into hiding. When Katherine was unsuccessful in finding him, she went to the police and issued an order against him so that he ultimately could not visit his own child. In the year 1990, Katherine would become pregnant yet again by a 43-year-old man named John Chillingworth. John was a former coworker, and they would give birth the following year to a boy named Eric. Their relationship lasted only 3 years, and Katherine would leave him for a man she was having an affair with named John Price. At the time, John had 3 kids of his own, and his past relationship had just ended in 1988, ultimately giving him custody of the 2 older kids. John was already well aware of Katherine's dangerous behaviors, but he would let her move into the house in 1995. And surprisingly, at first, his children even seemed to like Katherine. They would say everything was all roses at first. Well, in 1998, an argument broke out over John's refusal to marry Katherine, in which Katherine, being Katherine, would record some items John had stolen from his work and send the video to his boss. John would ultimately be fired from his job, in which he had worked for 17 years, and the same very day, he would kick her out of the house. News would begin to spread around the town of what Katherine had done. Now, Katherine must have the golden egg because John would re-engage the relationship only a few months later, although this time he refused to let her move in with him. The fighting became more frequent, and John would lose most of his friends because of Katherine. In 2000, a series of assaults would happen. In one of the events, Katherine would stab John in the chest, and he would kick her out yet again, and on February 29th, he would file a restraining order that kept her away from him and her children. Well, that afternoon, Price told his coworkers that if he did not return to work the next day, it would be because Katherine had killed him. They would beg for him not to go home, but he did because he worried about his children. And when John got home, he would find out that Katherine had sent the children over to a sleepover to a friend's house. John would then spend the evening with his neighbors before going back to bed at 11 p.m. Katherine would arrive while he was sleeping, and she would wake John just after having a shower, and they would have sex. John would then go back to sleep. Well, at 6 a.m. the next morning, the neighbors would notice that John's car was still in the driveway. And when John never showed up to work, they would send an employee to his house to see if anything was wrong. After noticing blood on the bedroom window, they would call the police. And when police entered the house, they would find Katherine in a comatized state from consuming pills, and they would discover John's body. John had been stabbed repeatedly with one of Katherine's butcher knives. Several hours after John had died, Katherine skinned his body and hung it from a meat hook. She would then go on to decapitate him. And to make matters worse, she would cut off parts of his body, cook them, and make 2 plates out of it with a side of vegetables and place them on the table. She would then put the children's names on sticky notes and place them right by the plates, ultimately hoping that they would come home and consume their own father. Well, the autopsy would discover that Katherine had stabbed John 37 times. On February 2nd, 2001, Katherine was charged with the murder of John Price, and she would enter a plea of not guilty, but would end up changing it to guilty. When the doctor took the stand and explained the horrific things she would do to Price, Katherine became hysterical and was sedated. On November 8th, the judge pointed out that Katherine's lack of remorse, as well as the nature of the crime, required a severe penalty. She was sentenced to life imprisonment, and her papers would be marked as never to be released. This was the first time that this verdict had been imposed on a woman in Australian history. In June of 2006, Katherine would appeal the life sentence, claiming that the penalty of life in jail without the possibility of parole was just too severe for this killing. However, this appeal was dismissed, with the judge writing that this was an appalling crime, almost beyond contemplation in a civilized society. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video, and I hope even more that you've never had thoughts of serving your significant other to their children. If you guys did enjoy, please consider dropping a like and subscribing. I will be posting weekly crime, and I will see you guys in the next one. Stay safe.